transport. The green and the efficient are the two themes that are running throughout this ITF, and the question of inclusivity. We're joined this afternoon by 4 panelists who I think will be able to enrich the perspective on this theme from quite different backgrounds and points of view. On my right, I won't say extreme right, given the sensitive politics in Europe about phrases like that. On my right, Paolo Costa, Port of Venice. Finn Arne Rongstad, who is responsible for environmental technology on the marine side in Rolls-Royce. Anna Larsen, who's Vice President for Global Sustainability in Wallenius and Wilhelmsen Logistics. And Tamid Mizan, who's Senior Technology Advisor in Corporate Strategy Planning Section in Exxon and based in Dallas, Texas. So this is not to typecast anyone here. Please feel free to come in on any of the topics we're dealing with. But we have the fuel side of the equation and the energy mix in one part. We have the supply chaining dimension and logistics perspective. We have the design side, so the efficiency through design and quality improvements. And with the port and port management side and the nature of ports as they fit into this broad theme. I think what I might do, this is in no order of preference, is perhaps to begin, if I could, Finn, with you on the question of design, technology, efficiency, alternative systems, hybrid systems. What is the front-end ship of today like, and what will tomorrow's fleet and ship look like, viewed from your design desk and viewed from your current production?
Yeah, I would say that we are at the forefront or at the brink of a new era in many ways. We have we are looking into alternative fuels now. LNG is increasingly becoming an alternative fuel of choice. But the most significant thing for the ship of tomorrow is the digital revolution that we see with that we really don't know exactly the extent of. I would say that there are 2 main things for greening the shipping today, and that is obviously it's reducing fuel consumption on board, the ton mile, and then it is the alternative fuels. It is those two main topics that we're talking about. And then reducing fuel consumption on board can happen with design, propulsion concepts, hydrodynamics. We can do a lot still on engine optimization. Again, alternative fuels where LNG is probably the most prominent alternative now, and also with energy storage and battery and all kind of forms of battery operations. That's also very much into the future now.
Let me take a few of those and go through them with you. On the LNG perspective, are the designers following a shift towards alternative fuels or driving a shift towards alternative fuels?
Yes, I would say that we as designers and equipment manufacturers have been pushing. There hasn't, but it is spreading and it's becoming. There is more and more interest also outside of Norway. Norway has been the leading front-end country when it comes to LNG usage, and we have about worldwide today there are something about 100 vessels, either in operation or under construction, that is running on LNG in one way or another.
And you see that intensifying over time?
Yes, maybe not as quickly as we thought some 3 or 4 years ago, where I remember DNV, GL, they were saying that by about this time there should be about 1,000 vessels or something like that. That didn't materialize. So it's probably because of the inherent sort of conservatism in the industry. It takes time to change.
And what about the digital revolution that you've spoken of? How will that manifest itself in shipping terms and in terms of efficiencies?
We have a goal where we see that it is quite possible to foresee a future with unmanned ships. So in 2030, 2040, we believe that there will be that fully autonomous shipping is not unheard of. There are many stepping stones towards that, and today it is quite possible to actually technically to have a remote controlled vessel. And we see all kind of technical the IT revolution with big data and so on is definitely also something you can adapt on ships, and that is happening, and it's all pointing towards more autonomous shipping.
I'm just fascinated with that. I mean, when we're looking at the autonomous car revolution, it's coming in a way kind of across the whole sector, but it got a very big push from the Googles of the world or the likes. In shipping terms, is part of the inertia that you've described related also to the producer-manufacturer who has a known and available technology and who sticks with it? Or will you see yourself pushing that technological envelope out towards, for example, towards autonomous shipping?
Yeah, we are definitely pushing it, and we are probably on the front page of if you Google, as you say, autonomous shipping, you will find that Rolls-Royce is more or less everywhere talking about this. But talking is one thing, and we actually also in Finland we are now setting up an operation together with the Finnish ferry company, where we will test out fully remote-controlled ferries.
A last thing to do with the fuel efficiency. You talked about ship design and so on. What kind of margins of efficiency are feasible simply by design improvement, hull improvement, the dynamics of ship, etc., the role of ballast in shipping?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer, because if you take every bit and piece and you fix this and you do a little bit here and you do a little bit there, everybody say there is a percentage here and there's a percentage there, and suddenly you have more than 100%. And obviously it doesn't work like that. But we think that there are still a lot to gain, and I would say from a vessel that is maybe better manned with more focus on operation and logistics and things like that, in addition to more novel propulsion systems and all these things. There's still possible to reduce fuel with 10 to 15%, I would guess.
Okay. And the trending, incremental innovation, delivering these kinds of things, or something more disruptive on the horizon?
Yes, and the disruptive thing in this case will be the digital shift.
Okay, the digital shift. Thank you for that. And I wanted to come back in on some of the other points. Tammy, if I can turn to you, viewed from your perspective in Exxon, if we're looking at efficiency improvements to do with design, we're also looking, as we do across vehicles, heavy goods vehicles, light delivery vehicles, etc., at fuel standards, quality improvements, or indeed for shipping, international standards to desulfurization, or climate change related decarbonisation targets. Viewed from you in the kind of strategic bridge of an energy ship, What are you seeing? What are the main trends? What are the things to watch out for and the things that may get in the way of achieving some of the desirable targets?
So, first of all, if I may, thank the ITF for,
Thank you.
if I may thank the ITF for putting together this panel and bringing a focus to the maritime industry, the maritime trade, and energy questions first. And before we get into the specifics of your question, which I'll address in just a moment, I'd like to remind folks that transportation is not just for transportation's sake. Why goods move and people move are really the people and people's lives that are in the background that we impact the economies and lives and standards of living of all of these people throughout the world. And the maritime industry and maritime trade really enables that. It enables the movement of goods, and therefore it connects manufacturing centers, production centers, to places where those goods may be purchased. It creates, helps maintain and sustain jobs on the manufacturing sides and on the retailing sides, on the distribution and the logistics, and everybody who participates in this huge ecosystem that makes up global trade. And I think I heard everything that I needed to know about trade and maritime trade this morning or this afternoon from our speakers. I heard the Minister of Denmark say, without transportation, there would be no trade. And I heard the Secretary General of the IMO describe how indispensable shipping is to the world. It is indeed the glue that holds global trade together. So it starts from people, and it's important to recognize that the global population is increasing by about 2 billion by 2040, we expect. And all of these growing populations and occurring primarily in the non-OECD countries will aspire to higher standards of living, which means goods and services. A lot of those goods, a lot of the economic activity, a lot of the jobs around all of that economic growth will be facilitated by the transport industry, the freight transport industry, and in particular, the marine transport industry. With that backdrop, we need to understand also that marine transport is one of the most effective and efficient ways of moving goods, ton of goods. If you compare it with rail, certainly with air transport or even overland transport. So it's already very, very efficient. It's a hard target to beat. Understanding that dynamic, we need to understand that when we think about energy to sustain and power those fleets, that energy has to be affordable, has to be reliable, has to be available everywhere that ships need to be. And all of those constructs are provided. We already have an ecosystem. We already have a system of providing fuel, heavy fuel oil for ships. That's how things have been so far. Within that concept, we also have an evolving regulatory system, evolving system with respect to fuel specifications. Most importantly, the ECAs, which are these coastal zones where a lower sulfur or a higher quality of fuel is required. And this makes a lot of sense because populations live along those coastal areas, and we need to make sure that the air quality along those population centers is not affected by shipping, and so the ECA regulations make a lot of sense. And we in industry are trying to provide those fuels, affordable fuels, reliable fuels, available to shipping to allow for that type of development to occur. More broadly, what we are seeing in the future are global sulfur caps, global caps on the amount of sulfur you can have in marine fuels. And that will be more of a sea change, more of a dramatic change to the refining industry. It'll be an unprecedented change, if you will, in terms of the volumes and in terms of the intensity that will be required to make that possible. So it's something that we don't take lightly. It's something that we are studying very, very deeply. But it is something that will be a major change, will have impact not only on marine fuels, but may have impacts on other petroleum fuels also. And in order to explain that, it's probably important for me to explain that, marine fuels, as with gasoline or diesel or aviation fuel, comes from the same source, comes primarily from crude oil. And we use every part of the crude oil. And because we use every part of the crude oil in refining, it makes all of the participants, all of the benefactors of that fuel benefit from this co-sharing of the fuel. Once you change that equilibrium, everything else has to fall into place. It requires investment, it requires technology, and so an evolutionary change is something that we can manage. A sudden step change is something that will have, it will be difficult to accommodate. And so that's one of the things that I'd like to point out, is that in the past, when, for instance, the eco regulations have come in, or other types of fuel regulations have come in, those have been evolutionary change and have been managed and have been almost transparent to most of the folks. When there is a step change, that's more of a challenge. And so
if I look at the IMO rules looking at 2020 and wanting greater desulfurization, on your time frame, is that evolutionary, or is that a step change?
That is a step change. That is a step change. And so we need to, think about how that might be managed, and understand, of course, that those types of changes require investments, require stability and long-term planning, and then you need to balance it out with the rest of the fuel portfolio.
Does the refining industry, so to ask it at an industry level, talk about Exxon if you want to as well, but I don't want to start poking into company-specific things, does the refining industry have the capacity to meet the step change towards the new standard on the current or predicted volume of global shipping?
I think there will need to be, as I said, investments, and there will need to be reallocation and refocusing of operations to allow that. And so it will not be an easy lift. As I said, it's an unprecedented change. And so anything that is unprecedented, it's hard to predict. And so that will be, it would have been better if it was more evolutionary than the step change that it is.
But it is doable?
I think we need to work it, and we need to work towards providing the fuels that folks need, and need to study it further.
Okay, let me switch, if I can, then to the logistics side. And we're really, it's a bit like, while we don't have shippers here, because you're in the logistics side, you might bring in some of the shipping piece as well for us. And I'm sure we will have plenty of people here in our audience who want to pick up points. But Anna, how do you see the rewards and the risks going forward to do with the regulatory political side, to do with the technical side, as we hear it, both to do with design and fuels and so on, and to do with the financial end of the risks and managing the chain through its financial evolution?
Thank you. I think that what's been quite clear listening to the debates here before us this morning and during the day is that we're seeing a shift in environmental performance requirements on all industries. I think shipping has for quite a long time been able to progress at setting its own pace, so to speak. What we see now, I think, is that there will be completely new requirements, especially there's this big change coming up on with regard to sulfur. I'm not sure I agree that it's a step change. It's been known for a very long time that it is coming. Of course, it's going to be a huge shift for industry in one go, that's for sure. But, and there is, of course, a big availability study going on now to help determine whether it's possible to actually operate this from 2020 or 2025. As a shipping company, from our perspective, we work with 25-year horizons when we invest. We wager hundreds of millions of dollars on one ship. So for us, that means a lot of risks that we need to manage when it comes to investing in new technology, and especially if you're talking about the kind of quite revolutionary and huge technology shifts that I see will be necessary going forward. And to really enable the development and adoption of innovations for greener maritime transport, we need to find ways to manage and reduce those risks. And as you mentioned, there's, I would say, three main areas. There's the political risk, the technical, and the financial risks. And there's different actors that we need to work with to be able to change the risk picture, basically. I think politically, it's clear that the governments are, and legislators in general, the IMO and national governments are the market makers. Setting strong, clear regulations, preferably global regulations that are coordinated, that's what creates demand for new environmental solutions. And making sure that those regulations are also properly enforced so that there's a very clear, this is something that you will need to follow, that you will need to, as a carrier, comply with. That's how we actually make sure that there is a need for change and that innovators will get funding, that there is a market for the new solutions that we need. And there's also, I think there's several vessel owners out there who are willing to stick out their neck. I'm sure that Rolls-Royce have been working with somewhere who are actually having you push the envelope. But if we want more of that behavior, we need to make sure that we don't feel that we're going to be penalized for going forward at the faster pace than regulation maybe.
And what is your fear of being penalized? How would you describe that in a...
I think a good example, which is the ballast water regulations. It's an IMO regulation that actually isn't ratified yet, but it's actually been around for a decade. And several companies have invested in and installed ballast water solutions. Now we're getting changes, and different countries are coming up with different criteria. It's all rather complex, but what it means is that if you have maybe invested in a solution, it's not sure that you're going to be able to run it. So actually having grandfathering clauses and principles in regulations, which means that, okay, if you have a vessel that's maybe 15 years old, we want to progress to a new standard, make that standard then for new vessels or new build. Like the NOx regulations are a good example for that, where the regulation applies to vessels built after a certain year. Sure. So then it becomes easier to manage. On the financial side, of course, for us, it's, if you're looking at trying out really sort of big shifts in new technology, it might be difficult to actually find good financing structures for that. I mean, shipping does have very solid financing mechanisms in place. But if you're looking at the big steps that we might see in a decade or so, decarbonization, I'm not sure that we're set up for that. One way, I mean, there's a lot of talk about CO2 levies and taxes and things. I'm not sure in shipping that would actually change behavior much, not at the sums that have been discussed now. But if we end up with a levy scheme, maybe one way of actually making sure that we're getting progress towards greener innovation and greener maritime transport would be to make sure that we can get those funds into a green shipping fund that can actually help finance those big steps in development.
At an industry level, with, for example, assistance from international financial institutions, or with kind of straightforward commercial banking, but just switching banking practice and preference?
I think we might need both. I think we might need both. And there's many, I think in general, we're going to need to collaborate across a lot of different sectors. I mean, suppliers, universities, governments, banking, class are of course crucial. And there's not going to be any change within shipping if class doesn't approve it. because then we can't operate with it, because then we're not insured. So there's a lot of, it's a pretty complex environment to make big technical changes in, and everyone needs to be working in the same direction.
As you talk about that, and outside regulatory body like IMO, at industry level, do you have stakeholder conversations that peer into that kind of future? Not just isolated the one from the other, but kind of trying in a more holistic way to understand what those elements are and how different people can contribute to solutions.
I think we do. I mean, I'm personally, another role that I have is that I'm chairing the Trident Alliance, which is a group of today about 35 plus shipping companies who have joined together to work for a strong enforcement of the sulfur regulations. For 3 reasons, really. For making sure that we get a level playing field. We're talking about a regulation that brings a 50% cost increase, if you talk about the simple solution, of shifting to MGO instead of high sulfur fuel or high sulfur bunker.
And is that a fuel-driven cost or a fuel plus technology?
That's a fuel-driven cost.
Fuel-driven.
So we see that making sure that we're talking to governments and having a good dialogue around how we can create stronger implementation, that's a very important area. We also work then with, I mean, in my role I have dialogues with different stakeholders like the ITF, with our suppliers. We work quite a lot with Clean Cargo Working Group. IBIA, Bunker Association, is also a strategic partner of ours. So we do have quite a lot of cross-border dialogue, but I think we're going to need more of that.
And let me ask you on the level playing field. I mean, I can understand the competitive logic that you don't want to be the most environmental friendly in the world and discover some other guy undercuts you in cost terms. But I can see how you might, I'll come to Paolo Costenborn, but how you might start policing these qualitative things inside a port or close to a port. But when you're out on the high seas, forgive my ignorance, but how do you enforce something that is, you know, miles from anywhere and hard to get deep down and dirty to see what's going underneath the shell of the ship and what's being burned and what's not?
Yeah, I think we've discussed that a lot, trust me. It's one of the big challenges with the global cap, be it 2020 or 2025. In theory, right now, I guess it's up to the flag states, really, to enforce. One of the things that we think would be a good solution, and that has been discussed in different forums, is to actually write in an addition into Annex 6 that would make it illegal, really, to carry bunker or fuel that would be of a sulfur level, sulfur content higher than the 0.5 that is allowed. And that would then mean that it would be unless you had some kind of scrubber or other abatement technology, that would make the regulation a bit clearer. It would also put the responsibility for enforcement to Port State Control, who have systems and processes in place to do this. And
who might have a different set of interests to flag states.
And the more digitalization you get, the more difficult it is to fool the systems, because monitoring of modern ships is streaming data anytime.
And forgive my question, I hesitate to name the company, but we are aware how technologies can cheat on tests to do with emissions. And I'm just wondering if a smart car is smart enough to cheat, is a smart ship going to be any different?
And we've had similar problems in the shipping industry.
Okay, Paolo, I'm going to come to. I mean, I'm happy to keep this conversation, and please do come in. Paolo is coming from the Port Authority side and Port Authority of Venice, and this whole theme of innovation and greening, sustainability from a port operator point of view, I think, is really fascinating. So, I'll let you off a bit to introduce Venice so that it locates for us where you are and what you're doing, and then to invite you back into the theme as it relates to our discussion today.
I have to say that within this conversation, Venice is perhaps easier place to deal because, for instance, it's more than 5 years that all the shipping lines coming to Venice are self-enforcing a cap in sulfur without any, which is much lower than the European regulation because you say, because they cannot dare that somebody could say that they are danger, make a danger to Venice and so on. So you know, that's we made a lot of things like this. We are now also working on introducing some LNG in advanced stage, in the sense we are convinced our concessionaire to use a tugboat which run fully on LNG. But we have identified that, for instance, just for introducing LNG is a problem. Is not a problem of technology. It's a problem to have the LNG available at the right place at the right moment. And since it has to be frozen a little bit, so that's complicated to maintain because you need the fridge somewhere there. For that, it's not so easy. So, for instance, now we are building 2 very big stores. What was the effect?
So terminal bunkers for LNG?
Yes, we are bunkering LNG within the port. And everybody thought that we are thinking of selling it to the ships, which is true. But few ships are ready to buy it. So how would like to invest, for instance, in our case, is 60 million euro on the storage, just for a few ships coming in. The guy, this is a private company that's invested that, find out a very clever idea, and then they organized the supply, the places for supplying LNG along the road, more or less from Venice to Milan and from Venice to the Brenner Pass, because this guy was an oil company, was used to sell gasoline on this station. They organized the station LNG, and then they just recently bought 50 or 70 trucks. They run only on LNG, but they are absolutely sure that they can get the LNG from one side to the other. So that's increasing the market. And that's a way. We have to build the market. Otherwise, we have the invention, but if you don't implement the market at the level which is enough to make it worthwhile, it becomes so difficult. So in our case, the ability of this guy to sell to 2 markets, the marine markets, we have also the marine, the lagoon, the small boats in the lagoon that we are trying to induce to do this. So there is a small local market, marine market, some the international market, some ships coming in and asking for that, plus the road market. That's becoming, apparently it's becoming worthwhile for these. So
the multimodal spread gives a return that any one mode would not.
We are, with this guy, which is a little bit, that's what I'm talking about innovation. We are working on a very, I don't know if it's just a visionary project. Venice was, in the mainland Venice, there was a petrochemical plant. And the petrochemical plant was they was distributing ethylene at up to Mantova, Ferrara, and Ravenna, so it's 250 kilometers inside. And I've understood that the ethylene has to go exactly with the same temperature of the LNG. We are trying to see if it's technically possible and then economically convenient to convert these pipes that was used for the ethylene for the LNG. If yes, that's we have found the solution because we can extend the market to the almost half of northern Italy, which is enough for making LNG something very useful. So it's something which is happening in the port, but it's not, what's happening in the port is not enough.
No. Well, let me ask you on the port and maritime part.
Yes.
Your business model as a port operator, do you
Yes.
give any incentive if a ship wants to pull in and load up with LNG instead of come in with traditional fuels?
Legally, we cannot. That's a problem. That's only, we need a national law or a European law that we allow to do that, but at the moment we cannot do that.
Some European ports have business models that are doing it.
Yes, okay, but unfortunately...
I can't say they're legal or illegal because I never discussed the legal
no.
dimension, but in practice I know they're doing it.
Unfortunately, the European port are still under national legislation, which is totally different the one from the other. So that's one of the problem. So we know that any attempt to introduce some common rules in Europe on the port that was not successful during the last 10 years, okay? Yeah. But what I was saying, this is what's happening in the port. Of course, we did everything else. We have solar, we have all the other things that we could do, so that's no problem with it. But in my view, that's a very tiny part of the problem, in the sense that if you think that the maritime transport has at least 3 legs, the maritime leg, the port leg, and the inland leg. Well, in my view, if you have the right port, which means of the right size in the right location, it can have an effect on the total emission much more important than the technological one. From the maritime leg, it's something that happened not because of us, but just because of the economic incentive coming from the cost of fuel, when the cost of fuel was very high. So when the ships decided to increase the size in order to reduce, was not just for environmental reason, was just for reducing the costs. Luckily, this has had a big effect, and now we know that if there is the usual figure that's container coming from Shanghai to Rotterdam, or from Shanghai to Venice, well, you have the reduction in the emission along all the maritime leg, which is much more important than the reduction of emission within the ports. That's very important. The second one is, should we decide, and that's a planning problem. It's a planning problem not only at the national level, but at least at European level, or vice versa, at European level or at least at the national level. If the port in the right place, what they say for the right place, if we reduce the kilometers run by the same cargo, they will reduce the emission. So it's the unitary emission multiplied by tons, multiplied by kilometers. So if the port is in the right position, in the sense which is more or less on the shortest route barycentrically to the shorter route to the customer, that's become much more important. That's the reason why we are investing in some innovation, because we think that, for instance, for our side, the situation in Europe, for me, is very, very clear. We have a concentration of ports in the northern range of Europe, because it used to be, the main line was to be North America, Europe. Now that's Far East Europe, it's quite clear that they are not in the right place. And day by day, it's happened that every day we are moving some cargo from the north to the south. For instance, during the last 8 years, during the big recession. So we cannot say that we doubled our throughput because there was an increase in an economy. It was just because there was a shift in share, because people realized that they were reducing the number of miles or kilometers made on that. So
you're saying you've doubled your volumes in the port,
yes,
even through a recession period, because of
not only
shifting patterns of trade.
Yes, by definition. Not only me, but for instance, North Adriatic, all our ports, the 5 ports, North Adriatic ports, Ravenna, Venezia, Trieste, Koper, and Rijeka, all together, of course, we are talking about 1 million TEU to 2 million TEU, which is peanuts in general. Well, not so, 2 million is not exactly peanuts. It's begin to see something interesting. But we double exactly starting from 2008 to 2014. So when the recession began, we began to increase this fact. And it's clearly because there was a shift in location of the manufacturing. The manufacturer came to us because the port cannot move. You don't have wheels. We cannot go where the customer are. Either the customer come to us or we cannot do anything. But the customer came to us. So what is the lesson that I draw from this situation? we should, if we can identify, if we design the port of the right capacity means able to accommodate the right size. I'm using right size, right capacity, because I don't want to say that's the bigger the better or the smaller the better, but there will be some, by definition, is larger than we used to, and maybe not like somebody is looking for, but I don't know, 18,000 TEU, this ship and so on. But so if we imagine which is the right size, we need ports to accommodate. If we are able to do that, and if we organize this traffic in the right place, that is in the port we are nearest to the market, that's the best contribution to reducing the CO2 emission than any, I'm sorry, invention, technical invention on this fact. Sorry, okay, just the last point. Of course, in doing that, there is a lot of ports that cannot do that because they have they cannot accommodate the big ship. They have to dredge. Even they are in the right place. That's my case. We are in the right place, but we have a very shallow water, so we cannot accommodate the big ship. But if you do something there, if you invent something there, and you just resolve this bottleneck, the effect in terms of emission, in reducing emission, is the most. Which was our idea, and that's I'm finished with my, of course, with my story, that we figure out a new port machinery in which you separate a place in where you serve the ship with a place in where you serve the market. So we are using the existing ports, so we don't have to change anything from the infrastructure point of view. We just invented this an offshore terminal, which is it's not an offshore in the sense there is no storage in the. It's only a machine for transforming from one big ship to some. Sure. Once again, for small ship, run LNG and so on. So if we use the existing ports served by one machinery that can accommodate the big ship, we can do the two things: to have the maximum reduction in emission because of using the big ships and reducing the inland leg of the cargo. Yeah.
So just one or two questions for you, Paolo, and yes. I want to bring in then some observations and comments. Your business model, as you describe, has grown autonomously. You said the guys knocked on your door, that you have the capacity to break bulk of big ships, but to transship into the hinterland through existing infrastructure. Yeah. And the hinterland connection.
I don't like to call him transshipping, because transshipment means that transshipment is an old model. It's that the big ships come in somewhere in the Mediterranean, then there is a feeder ship. No. I want to come directly straight to the North Adriatic, or in my case, North Adriatic, with a big ship. Then to have, I call it a tool, which is there is a place in which not only you have, that's a place in which you move the container from the big ship to, that would be too long to explain. So, okay, when we invented the container, why we invented the container? Because within the ship it was a mess. There was so many things to organize and so on. So we thought that we put it in a box that was much easier to handle. But when you have 18,000, 20,000 boxes, we are again the same situation. So we decided to identify a new unit, which is around 400 TEU. This unit will be carried by a floating cassette that will be transported by a submersible ship. And this submersible ship, so that's make very flexible. You can go wherever you want. We organize the system from our offshore terminal to, for the moment, 3 onshore, which will be Marghera, Chioggia, where the existing infrastructure we use. Yeah. So we don't have to build anything. So we only built this tool outside that, since the tool is able to accommodate any kind of ship, we located it when the water is 22 meters deep. So I hope it's enough for the next century. Okay, and even if we have 12 meters within the port or 9 meters, that's fine because so organize these things. It seems to me that's the best way. I mean, for us to accommodate this increased demand from the surrounding market. But from the point of view we are talking about here, is that we get the maximum reduction in emission, much more than from the technological point of view.
Anna, you wanted to come back in, and then I will come back to the fuel side. Yes,
Yes, I think the it's interesting to hear the effects of the fragmentation. It's something that we see, and it's of course a big contribution to how environmentally efficient you can transport things. I mean, we as a company work for mainly the big auto and equipment makers. We transport finished automobiles and finished equipment. So we do roll-on, roll-off. And what we've seen is that whereas it used to be, as you say, big lines basically going Europe to the US or more really Asia, Europe, Asia, America, we've now got a huge fragmentation of auto production and also a very, very flexible production. So depending on how market demand develops, depending on how currencies fluctuate, depending on how taxes and embargoes and trade agreements develop, our customers can move their plants and move their production very quickly. So we need to be adjusting. And we also get, I mean, I guess there is a limit in a way then to how more efficient you can be by building bigger vessels, because that really requires that if you've got very big oceans, you need some certain concentration, and you don't, it's not efficient to go with large ocean-going vessels into lots of small European ports. It doesn't really help anyone. So for us, I have to say it's one of the things that we have started looking at again is actually transshipment or this kind of hub and feeder. Container vessels are doing it, definitely, and have been for a while. And I think with the quality levels that we have today, it's something that we can look at again. And that will help both the environment and our own efficiency.
Thank you. Tamil, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I think Paolo made 3 points, 3 very important points that I wanted to amplify if I could. One of the points he made was how the location of the port is very critical to the entire the emissions profile, kind of the soup to nuts emissions profile of a particular piece of cargo. But aside from the engineering, another activity has been really greatly influencing the amount of fuel used, which is operations, primarily slow steaming, and folks are very familiar with this. But this is the idea of if you have the capacity and you run the ship more slowly, the resistance will be to that movement of the ship is low, and so you burn a lot less fuel. If you burn a lot less fuel, emissions are lower, both greenhouse gas emissions but also sulfur emissions. So that's a very natural kind of way to reduce emissions, but something that can be built into the engineering of the ship also. The other point that Paolo made, which again bears amplifying, is he described how multimodal sharing of the LNG made the entire thing more practical. That's something that we've been doing in the refining industry, really, that sharing for many decades, and that is why one of the reasons that fuel for shipping is very affordable. And when you think about the investment required to produce marine distillate, which will be the fuel that we will require under the IMO cap, there's the cost aspect of it, but also there's a cost in greenhouse gas emissions because producing that distillate fuel requires removing that sulfur, which means you have to put hydrogen into the fuel, very energetically intensive process. And so there are upstream greenhouse gas implications of making that fuel. So one needs to look holistically at the chain, at the life cycle chain, and one needs to compare all of the solutions that are possible and look at, on a sound science basis, on a cost-benefit basis, what are the solutions that are good for everybody and achieve the desired target. So I could offer up, for instance, onboard scrubbing, and Anna referred to that as one possible way to achieve those objectives. Marine distillate is certainly one objective, and not all all solutions fit every ship and every situation. And LNG is another option if the infrastructure were in place, and I applaud Paolo for his leadership in that, if the bunkering infrastructure is in place, if the safety procedures are in place, and then the production of the fuel is in place, that is a very viable option in terms of a low sulfur fuel. So many options are in place. We need to test all of those and make sure that we achieve the goals. And so the principle that's underlying this is having policies that are technology neutral. We have a goal, but we don't need to dictate which technology achieves it. Make sure that we have we understand the costs and understand the benefits, and let the markets do its thing. That's how we believe this should be done. And last point I'd like to make is that, not to give you the impression that the industry is sitting on its hands with this, and ourselves, ExxonMobil, is investing over $1 billion in a coker in Antwerp to transform residual oil fuels into distillate products. So in an industry which is not investing as much, especially in Northern Europe, we have gone out and kind of shown leadership in that aspect. So I think there's lots of solutions there. We need to make sure that the solutions are economical. At the end of the day, shippers like Anna will not want to buy fuel that doesn't make economical sense.
Let me ask you about something that you mentioned in lots of fascinating things you had to add there. The upstream CO2 consequences of producing this new distillate. How does it net out in numbers? If we're planning also to decarbonize as well as desulfurization, what are the numbers to do with this distillate that you've described?
Yeah. So there are numbers out there, and I won't ascribe the specific numbers, but the production of the distillate does require more intensive treatment, and does require the injection of hydrogen into the fuel. Hydrogen is energetically and CO2-wise expensive to produce, so that's kind of the fundamental thing. The other option, of course, is scrubbing on board, so continue to use the same fuel, but scrub out the sulfur on board. Now that has its own costs associated with it, investments that the shipper now has to make.
But there is a problem with the cost of the disposing of the scrubbers.
That's there.
That's
so there's
a very environmental issue.
Yeah, there's an entire
one.
environmental question there.
And
the scrubbers?
Is that the port's headache, or is that the shipper's headache, or the shared headache?
It's a shipper headache because we don't allow them to do that.
So the other part of that, Pat, is that the scrubbing itself has some energetic penalty associated. So you need to look at the net. And on a net basis, I think scrubbing wins out. At least the studies I've read suggest that.
Please.
I mean, it's very easy to talk about greening of transport, sort of in general. But one of the discussions we had just before the meeting here is what's the most important thing to go for. And in general, a lot of the things that we can do to reduce the health effects of shipping emissions, that is reducing sulfur, reducing NOx, reducing particles, which are problems or issues that the auto industry, the land transport industry have already resolved, and that we still have to sort out. And that comes with a certain CO2 penalty, most of the things that we do to reduce those emissions. Not major, but it's something that we need to take into account. So and maybe right now, frankly, it's more important that we sort out the sulfur and the NOx and the particle things that actually have a human health effect.
Well, particularly then close to land and in ports, just to ask in both investment and in design terms, do all or most modern ship designs include the capacity to take onshore power supply when they're in port, so that you simply don't have to rely on systems that are burning off and producing all this particulate?
It's not a standard feature.
It's not standard. And forgive my naivety, but why not, if we're into greening, have a kit that is a standard plug and play when you come to a port with your ship?
There is a cost associated both when you build a ship and also from the port side to provide electricity. Even in Norway, where we have abundant amount of hydropower and so on, it's a big issue to get, for example, in the port of Bergen, it has really some severe NOx and SOx problems in the clear winter days. They still haven't, I mean, it's a huge investment to get enough power down in
I saw in the I think it was in the cruise port in Hamburg, a very interesting system by Siemens, which was being plugged in for onshore power supply. I mean, these are, you know, kind of small urban centres that arrive into a port area.
But in our case, well, we have, I think, one of the largest cruise terminals in Mediterranean. When we have 8 ships together, which means 24 passengers, 24,000 passengers, plus at least 8,000 crew. If you have to supply the energy, cold ironing the quantity of the energy needed, in our case, is the doubling the quantity that we need for the city. And we are dealing with this problem now. The problem is the redundancy. What's happening is if the system collapses, so the ship has anyhow to maintain its own powers inside because
a standby at the very least. Yeah.
So that's now we are working of having a redundancy in the port, so to have to receive the energy from 2 different points, as far as the big quantity are concerned, and to have the possibility to be sure that in any case, but we cannot imagine that we can that we close the city in order to supply the energy to the ships, and so the quantity involved very relevant. So that's one for me at the moment is we are examining very different technologies, European, new Chinese technology. There are many of them. That's it was very interesting in your proposition in the sense that, of course, these people that are trying to sell me cold iron say that they are much better than scrubbing, but that's we have to find out because, by definition, the scrubber, since the scrubber is something which is in the ship, is their own problem. So that's that's enough.
But scrubbing is not enough in a port because you have all the NOx issues as well.
Yes.
And the only thing
the
only thing, in particulate matter, definitely. But the only thing that will solve that, apart from having pure electricity on board, is to run by LNG. And more, especially big cruise ships, are being built with LNG generator sets.
Yes.
Now.
Okay.
And in Hamburg, for example, they have also a barge,
That's
LNG
correct,
barge.
with LNG barge, yes. Yeah.
So that's a perfect solution because, well, you with LNG, you reduce your CO2 and greenhouse emission by about 20%, and you eliminate NOx, more or less eliminate sulfur, and there is no particulate matter.
Yeah. So it's it ticks all the boxes.
Absolutely, the Kinder Egg.
I think, but what we do see actually, and I mean, we have looked into shore power as well, and I mean, for us, it's actually one of the bigger problems is that there's no international standard. It's a little bit like when you're traveling, you need an adapter to simplify it a lot.
Yes.
And if, like us, we're going to lots of different ports, it's different. It just doesn't work out. Yeah. But there is. Today, I was in Beijing last week and talking to the maritime transport authorities there, and they're investing a lot in trying to improve air quality through regulating emissions from shipping and providing solutions. LNG is one, but they're investing billions in shore power. So I think that we will see technology developing.
A big shoreside investment.
Yes.
To do with that.
And that's really, and of course there again we come into, if you look at the full cycle, how good is it actually from a CO2 perspective? Being China, then there will be coal involved, which of course isn't that good.
The well-to-wheel concept.
Quite. But on the other hand, their main problem is the air quality around the ports. And if you can then make sure that you're moving whatever emissions you have to a coal plant that's somewhere inland where you can put scrubbers and cleaning, which is easier to manage on site, then that is a better option to achieve the goals that they have.
Okay. Finn, you want to come in?
No, in many ways, I mean, this reminds me, I mean, if you cut, it's like it's a troll with many heads. I mean, if you cut off one, there is another one popping up. And that is, but there are still quite a few low-hanging fruits in reducing and greening shipping. And then, just for example, with the digital transformation, we can monitor performance, for example, much more. You will have systems today where you use the human factor that people don't really want to pollute, but you give them tools so they can actually compete between themselves. I mean, who is running this ship most efficiently? And you can very easily monitor that today. For example, with trimming of your ship. 10 years ago, it wasn't really easy to monitor the trim and how that affected the ship. Today, that is very easy with the modern sensors and all that. And you can have savings of 3, 4, 5% on a journey across the Atlantic, just by optimizing your vessel and trimming your engine and output and all these things.
Anna, do you have, in terms of a fleet management policy, onboard gaming of who's the best at doing this stuff and finding in-house best practice?
We have systems installed now that we get sort of direct data from the different systems in operation continuously, and we run a lot of diagnostics in that and monitor per vessel, per captain, who's doing what. And then we of course bring that back when we have our captains' conferences and things like that. I'm not sure exactly actually how. We haven't gone into proper gamification, but I know that we do provide feedback.
But you do a learning by doing process.
Absolutely, and we analyze. We look at the energy consumption profile over the whole journey, over a leg, and analyze that. Okay. Because, for example, as you say, slow steaming is a very good way of saving fuel, but also stable steaming. So that we don't get, slowing down for a while because you feel that you've got time, and then you speed up to reach something. So being able to monitor and give feedback on that kind of behavior is of course a huge efficiency, driver efficiency. But if you look at getting to sort of step changes and finding innovations, I think one important factor will actually be for us to look outside shipping a bit as well. There's a lot of technologies that, because shipping is quite special, it's a harsh environment. We've been using now when we've installed quite a number of scrubbers, and just getting the sensors to work in a sea environment is difficult. Sensors that work perfectly on land become difficult to manage when they're sitting in a smokestack at sea. Sure. But there's, I think, quite a lot that we can find by actually going outside the industry. So actually collaborating across technology fields and across industries, I think, is an important factor. And I think
we have the benefit of having one big leg in the aviation industry, and we've been doing this with monitoring engines up in the sky for years, and we do have centers where we actually follow engines wherever they are, and we are able to see whatever plane, I mean, if they're landing or taking off and so on, who is pushing it harder and who's using more fuel. With British Airways, they love to get this information. With the Lufthansa, for example, they are afraid that the unions, they will.
But in that context, you can use kind of technology transfer in-house, albeit that you need to
that the information is available and can be used as.
Pat, it's important to mention along the lines of Finn's trolls that while LNG is a very attractive solution from an emissions point of view, especially the health effects type of emissions that Anna talked about, it is important to ensure the proper engineering and procedures in place to avoid fugitive emissions and methane slip from the engines, because you do not want to emit methane during the process. You want to burn the fuel, not have it leak. So that's an important distinction and important consideration in planning for all of this.
I'm just going to check. You've all been sat here attentively, and I'd like to see if there are any questions or comments. Can I borrow that, Finn, for just a moment? Are there any questions or comments that anyone here would like to make? Let me just pass along in the order that you've presented yourself. Please introduce yourself and then question or
My
comment.
name is Matthias Sprödle from Ecofis. I heard a couple of times LNGs, and I was just wondering, what about biofuel? Is that not an option at all, or is it just a cost aspect? So I'd be happy to get a view from all of you.
Thank you. Hang on to that question, and we'll come back. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Toshi Sakatsume from European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I have a question about level playing field. I think we discussed about IMO regulations, but also I'm a bit worried about taxation. Somebody, we have like Panama sagas, and if some shipping companies, pay high taxations and others do not pay enough taxation, it's not fair competition in international market. Yeah, okay. And similarly, like environmental regulations. I guess IMO set rules, but some countries have high enforcement power, but others do not enforce. Okay. That's also very unfair, competition. So I think the landscape would change. I don't know how Panama type, offshore, the regulations will change over the time. But I'm just fearing that, this kind of international competition landscape will change over time. So maybe you can, I'm not pointing fingers, but, somebody can comment on this competition.
It's a really interesting question. Anyone else over on this side? Okay, so with the biofuels question, and we have this other question which we touched on briefly, I think, at the outset, which is the question of compliance, sanctions, and impunity. And I guess your hypothesis is there's a lot of impunity out there, and so the guys who follow the rules get screwed. That seems to me, we won't go into the Panama Papers, but we have at least some other chapter in that question. The biofuels question, who would like to pick it up?
Yeah, the answer is it's a very good and fuel. Biofuel can be used, but you will get rid of the sulfur issue, but you will not get rid of the NOx issue. And then there has been some debate about actually where it comes from and what generation and all these issues, but that can be burned in any reciprocating engine, no problem. Regarding the bio-LNG or biomethane, that's by far the best fuel you can burn. And in any LNG engine will be more than happy to run on that. The question is, of course, how do you get hold of it? And from the farming industry and so on, it's a bit elaborate. But I know in Norway there is a plant up in the middle of Norway where they're actually using debris from fish farming and putting that into to make biomethane, and that will be used on trucks and also to a certain extent on ships.
Anyone else on the biofuel question, Tamil?
You like to?
No?
So the question with biofuels in terms of just the operability of the engine, I think Finn spoke to that, but it's two things I would say. One is cost and availability. So in terms of the cost of making those biofuels, they're even expensive for overland or for trucking and on-road usage. For ships, they would be very, very expensive. If you think of biodiesel or HVO, hydrogenated vegetable oil, and the like. The other issue that's important to point out is that food-based biofuels, so oil seeds and the like, or fuels derived from oil seeds, do have this impact called indirect land use change, where production in one part of the world is connected by markets to production in other parts of the world. so that net, when you add all of those up, the actual greenhouse gas reductions using biofuels don't appear as attractive that you might think. So, you know, when we talk about biofuels, we would rather ascribe to second generation biofuels, so biofuels that are not connected to food crops. So waste, biofuels from waste would be an example of that. The problem with that concept is that that technology is still immature, can't make the kind of volumes or at the costs that would be required even for on-road applications, let alone marine. However, it's really, it is worth exploring. It has potential. We ourselves are exploring and doing a lot of R&D in these second-generation biofuels, including algae biofuels, because we do believe it has potential, but it has potential in the long time horizon. So we're talking decades before the biotechnology is evolved to a state where it can produce the scale and the cost required.
Okay. Scale and cost big. Anna, do you have any comment on that?
No, I think that was a very good answer.
Okay. Paolo.
I dare to give an information in the sense that because I'm talking something that's from the technological point of view, I don't know myself. But no. But
then you must give an opinion.
No. But something that happened. You know, our in the Venetian industrial area, which is connected with the port, there was a refinery. There was, until 2 years ago, it was refined more or less 10 million ton of oil per year, and it was serving the market around Venice. Suddenly, 2 years ago, Eni decided to close the refinery and to convert so-called biofuel. Maybe at that time was the first generation, and now they try to move to the second generation. But I have to say that in 2 years, we closed the refinery. Now for the port point of view, it's fine, because instead of getting the ships with the oil, now we have the ships with the refined products. So for me, it's the same. They are combined with, it used to be combined with palm oil, which was, we had the first problem. Now it's moving to the second things. Apparently, it had a great successful. It was very successful on the market. And they are planning to double this plant. So the idea of to mix fossil fuels with something else and to sell it as bio something, I don't know if it's just a marketing procedure or it's something fine, but in any case, it's going on and with success on the market.
Well, certainly there's some bio-aviation gas mixes, because some of the airlines are using that. What I want to do is what I might call, since it came up, the Panama question. I mean, one of these, the issues about the flag states, the sanctions, etc. You had made earlier, Anna, the suggestion, that you could have a different kind of ports-based capacity to regulate this. But whose job is it to sit down and figure that out and to produce the appropriate regulatory change? Because absent the change, the tenor of the question is that you might end up even paying a sanction, but that the sanction is derisory compared to the savings you make in cheating, and therefore the incentive is to cheat and not to play by the rules.
Yeah. I think it depends. I mean, who's responsible depends really on the regulation. But I think the sulfur regulations is a good example. Of course, it's an IM, and it follows the most common pattern for shipping anyway, which is that you have an IMO regulation, and then that of course needs to be brought into law and sort of ratified into national law by all the signatories of that law, of that regulation, of that convention, and then it then has to be implemented also into their national sanction schemes, etc. And that's been one of the challenges with the North American and European ECA, especially in Europe, where we've got several different countries. So if you look at it, a well-functioning regulation that can provide a proper level playing field really relies on 3 or 4 different things. So first of all, having a well-written regulation from a global perspective that's also then translated into in a consistent way into national regulations in the area that's relevant, that you have a good level of actual sort of physical enforcement, fuel inspections, testing, random checks, that's actually carried out in a way that's very on a level that makes it very clear to all the shipping companies that this is something that we're following up, that we're checking. As you mentioned, you need to have sanctions that are really deterrent. You should not, unfortunately, what you get sometimes in language around sanctions is that you should nullify the financial gain from any, and that's just not enough. I mean, if you're looking at sulfur and you're checking maybe 10 or 20% of the ships that come into your port, and your risk of getting caught is this small, and if you get caught, you only get to fined for what you're...
For the one you were caught for.
Exactly, exactly. So that doesn't really make any sense. And of course, also then you need to have a legal system where you can actually get these penalties doled out in an effective manner. We've seen some cases now with self-regulations where you've got maybe a very ambitious inspection scheme, you're doing all the right things, but then you actually do not have the possibility to bring any of the culprits, any of those actually cheating through the court system because of the requirements of proof of intent being way too high. So to be able to have something where you can also sanction pretty quickly. I mean, we see, I think the US system is a pretty good example. They're more prone to and have larger leeway when it comes to arresting ships, to quickly negotiate fines. And that means that, you know, people just follow the regulations because you're afraid of the consequences. And that's ideally how it should be.
A brief answer to this is this question, and that very elegant exposition you just gave, also the actual or unactual question on an IMO agenda in an active and realistic way, or have we having a kind of a conceptual discussion where in the ideal world this would be a wonderful solution?
No, I think this is very, very actively discussed. I mean, among European nations, definitely, and if we get our way, also at the next IMO meeting.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes,
I'd like to mention one measure that we've done in Norway, which is not using regulations or whip. It's more of the carrot. It's the NOx fund that you might have heard of. And it's been a tremendous success. This is based on a tax that every ship that sails between Norwegian ports will have to pay. But it's not paid just into the fiscal sort of government coffers. It's distributed by the Norwegian Shipowners Association, so that you can actually get money out, quite considerable contribution to do measures with your ship to reduce.
So a polluter pay tax that is earmarked to go directly back into the shipping industry. That's a very interesting innovation.
And it works like a dream, well. But nobody seems to have been able to copy it yet. But it works actually very well. Well,
that's very interesting because we've been, I won't go into it, but quoting other good Norwegian examples of kind of first mover things that have worked well in practical terms. Paolo, do you have a comment on this?
No. Or just that there's something you have to think about. It looks like if the legal framework will allow is to do, I agree that would be much more efficient than any because we do enforce, in our case, just for the cruise vessel, all cruise vessels are inspected by the Coast Guard, all of them. When they come to us, they have to have 2 different tanks with a different degree of sulfur. The Coast Guard control how much fuel is went in and went out in both of them. So theoretically, there is a very good control system. But I agree that's just controlling is something interesting. But if you use incentive, it's much better.
We have one last question or comment on here. Yes,
sorry
please.
to interrupt, but I was listening very positive for this, and I can inform you a little about. You talked about Norway, Sweden, and I could include Denmark. It is perhaps not a secret anymore, but the three government has decided to make what they call a Scandinavian platform for biogas implementation, including to the maritime industry. We have now run the first test of a ferry. A ferry is easy, it's a low-hanging fruit, because it's easier for ferry to install and the machinery to be used for biogas. I'm talking about second generation, not only garbage, only fish, raw product after slaughter, this kind of thing. And the first result is obvious, very, very positive. I don't want to overestimate it, but I have a little brochure I have produced and put on where someone you can follow up and see, are we successful? I know the Dutch government is now planning also. Maybe someone here can give information about that. But they have also ordered 2 ferries that should go with biogas to the small islands or the French islands. So maybe we have the technology maybe not next year, but in a couple of years. So I hope that will be successful. Thank you.
Okay, so this is something that is real.
It's real.
That is piloted, but
it is also political support.
It's not industry-wide, no, but it's an attempt to start something.
It's supported by the industry, but they say, okay, show us that it works, show us where we should go, and let's try to follow. And they all start saying, we don't want to use the first generation because we don't want to see that we are using food for sailing with our people. So this is out of the question in this political sense. Okay. But they say it's a start, maybe successful.
And this brochure people can get outside.
It would be a couple of them, they're available. There's a platform where you can look for more about the progress. So
thank you very much. I'm going to start wrapping up. Oh, Catherine, bonjour. Vous êtes? We're pretty well near the end of this session, and I have found it really interesting. Thank you very much. The contributions have been diverse but very connected, and perspectives that I think kind of some way reinforced and enriched each other. In terms of a going away thought, either one that you're taking away or that you're giving away to the rest of us, I would just like to go across the panel on our theme, Innovation for Greening Maritime Transport, and what would it or they be? So not a PhD thesis. I'm looking for a tweet and not an email, in a way. But what would be your going away tweet that either you carry away from this conversation or you would like us to carry away? Let me start on my right here, Tamil, and work across.
Okay. So perhaps a going away thought is, in terms of innovation, we really don't know everything. We don't know the future. We don't know what might work and what might not work. And there's a whole, and as the gentleman indicated, there's a whole world out there that are working on solutions, whether it's in maritime transport or other forms of other sectors of the economy. We don't know what we don't know, so we must encourage all solutions. And we must encourage all solutions on a level playing field. I think that's come out in the past. Encourage all solutions on a level playing field based on sound science. Allow the markets to find the solutions that are most cost-effective to societal goals. That's what I will leave with.
Okay, so it's the neutral point you made earlier. Go with what works best and delivers. Anna.
Yes, a going away thought. I think we have a forum here today where we've got a large amount of governments and authorities, and I think something I would like to leave that audience with in particular is this message that you are the market makers. I think within shipping we've got an industry that is very willing to change. We've got high levels of technology. We've got suppliers who can help us in that journey. But in order to take on the big investments, we need to have good and clear regulations with strong enforcement.
Thank you. That's very clear. Finn?
Yeah, I think we are very well represented here and showing all the facets of the shipping industry. You have the ports, you have us who are making ships and ships equipment, owners, and oil fuel producers. Maybe we should have had a politician or two, but I think that it's incredibly important that we are having these discussions with all these facets, and there is willingness to make a change, and together we can do it. Yeah.
Thank you, Paolo.
I would insist in one sentence, in the sense that at the heart of the port activity, we are talking a very basic industry. It's a crane moving one piece of something from a ship to the land. So per se, there are a lot of attempts to innovate on this narrow phase, but nothing is happening. This is much more important what can be done, what can, starting from this point, the innovation that can change the behavior, both of the ships and on the inland distribution. So that's the idea we are following. Inventing a new way of organizing the basic activities in order to induce or allow both the ships and the logistic distribution to become much more efficient. That seems to me that there is much more innovation to find out in this way. So for us, it's useless to concentrate on the tiny leg, the port leg. Okay, useless, of course, if we can invent something new. But we are I would say that at least in the cargo maritime industry, we are still waiting for a new wave of innovation, like the invention of the container. The invention of the container was it was by per se, it was not a technological innovation. It was just the idea, to have a package. Well, if you go in this direction, I think that since we have to move large volumes of things quickly and much more in longer distance, because the worldwide now all the markets are becoming global. So any innovation that will help in increase the efficiency of maritime and inland, even if geared on the ports, could be something to look after very carefully.
Thank you very much for that. I want to thank everyone who's taken the time to be here this afternoon, for those of you who've contributed with comments or questions. I'm struck in listening to this conversation, which I think it was, and I think we get a bit more out of each other and out of these sessions when we can have these kinds of intelligent conversations. Thank you very much for that. I'm struck by the fact that some years ago, because today at breakfast time there was a little moment to mark the 10th anniversary of the foundation of the ITF. 10 years ago, an awful lot of these debates were about if, and now they're about what, how, and when. So we've moved actually quite a radical distance, that the question is not the existential yes or no question, it's how to do it, how to collectively use that skill and wisdom that's there. And to Tamil, to Anna, to Finn, and to Paolo, thank you so much for a wonderful contribution this afternoon.